Lauren had been acting differently lately, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. We'd been married for over 10 years, and she was my best friend, my partner in everything. But there were moments, little ones, that gnawed at me. She started coming home late more often than usual, with vague explanations about work or last-minute plans with friends. I didn't think much of it at first. Everyone gets busy, and Lauren had always been social. But the excuses began to feel rehearsed, the kind of half-truths you give when you're hoping someone doesn't ask too many questions. Then, there were her late nights on her phone. She'd always been open with it before, leaving it on the counter or tossing it onto the couch when she got home. Now, she kept it close, turning the screen away when I walked by or slipping it into her pocket like it was second nature. It wasn't blatant, not enough to call her out on, but it planted a seed of doubt I couldn't ignore. One night, she told me she was meeting her friend Haley. It seemed innocent enough. Haley and Lauren had been close for years, and they often met up for dinner or drinks. But something in her tone that evening felt off. It was too casual, like she was trying to smooth over a wrinkle I hadn't even noticed. As the hours passed, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was the way her words hung in the air, just slightly out of place. Around 9 p.m., I decided to call Haley. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe I just wanted to hear something that would put my mind at ease. "Hey, Haley," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Just checking in. Lauren said she was with you tonight. Everything good?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Haley spoke, her tone was confused. "Lauren? No, I haven't seen her tonight. Is everything okay?" My stomach dropped. It wasn't the answer I was expecting, and I scrambled to come up with something that wouldn't make Haley suspicious. Yeah, I must have misunderstood.
No worries."
I hung up quickly, my hand trembling slightly as I set the phone down. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind racing. Lauren wasn't with Haley, so where was she? When she got home later that night, she acted like everything was normal. She kissed me on the cheek, asked how my evening was, and went straight to the shower without missing a beat. Her ease, her casual demeanor, it made me feel like I was the one losing my mind. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong, and I needed to figure out what it was. The next evening, Lauren talked me into going to a party with her friends. I wasn't in the mood. After the weirdness the night before and her vague explanation of why Haley might have forgotten their plans, I wasn't exactly in the mood to socialize. But Lauren had that way about her, the one where she could talk me into just about anything. She promised it would be fun, just a small group, nothing too wild. "You need to get out more," she teased, her hand on my arm, her eyes doing that pleading thing I used to think was endearing. So I caved. We arrived at the party, a lively gathering at someone's sprawling backyard, complete with twinkling lights and the kind of upbeat playlist that seemed custom-made for warm, slightly tipsy conversations. I recognized a few people, faces I'd seen in passing at other gatherings or heard Lauren mention. But most of them were strangers. For the first half hour, it was fine. I clung to Lauren as she introduced me to people. She laughed and charmed her way through the crowd effortlessly, like she always did, and I did my best to keep up. But soon enough, I found myself standing by the drink table, nursing a beer while Lauren flitted from one group to the next. She seemed to know everyone, and as the minutes ticked by, I realized she hadn't been by my side in a while. I scanned the crowd but didn't see her. No big deal, I told myself. She was probably catching up with an old friend or making the rounds. But the party was loud, the noise grating, and the feeling in my gut, one I'd been trying to ignore for weeks, tightened. After another 10 minutes, I decided to find her. I wove through the clusters of people, politely brushing past groups mid-laugh or deep in conversation. There was no sign of her inside. I stepped into the kitchen, where a few people were gathered, chatting around the counter. Lauren wasn't there either. That's when I glanced out the window and saw her. She was in the yard, standing near the edge of the patio, partially hidden by the shadows of the tall hedges that bordered the space. My heart lurched as I noticed she wasn't alone. A man stood close to her, closer than I was comfortable with. I couldn't see his face clearly from where I stood, but I could make out his posture. He was tall, casually dressed but confident. His body angled toward hers in a way that felt too familiar. For a moment, I stayed frozen by the window, my hand gripping the frame. I told myself it was nothing, that I was misinterpreting what I was seeing. Maybe it was a friend, someone she hadn't seen in a while. Maybe they were just catching up. But then I saw her hand. It rested on his shoulder, light but deliberate. Not the kind of touch you give to a casual acquaintance. My chest tightened as I watched him lean in slightly, their faces inches apart. I couldn't stand there any longer. My feet carried me outside before I could stop myself, the cool night air doing nothing to calm the fire building in my chest. As I stepped onto the patio, I could hear snippets of laughter and conversation from the other side of the yard. The noise of the party seemed distant, muffled, like it was happening in another world. All I could focus on was them. When I reached the edge of the patio, I stopped in my tracks. Lauren was standing so close to him that their bodies nearly touched. Her hand was still on his shoulder, her fingers lightly brushing the fabric of his shirt. And then, as if to twist the knife in my chest, she leaned in. Her lips met his. It wasn't a quick, friendly peck. It wasn't a misunderstanding or an accidental brush. It was deliberate, slow, and intimate in a way that made my stomach churn. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, and my vision blurred at the edges. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing, to reconcile the woman I thought I knew with the one standing in front of me. The man, Andy, I remembered now. She'd mentioned his name once or twice in passing. Smiled as he pulled back slightly, his hand resting on her hip. Lauren didn't push him away. She didn't look embarrassed or guilty. She just smiled back, her face lit with an expression I hadn't seen in years. It was like the air had been sucked out of the yard. The noise of the party faded entirely, replaced by the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I wanted to charge over, to demand answers, to make sense of what I was seeing. But my feet felt glued to the ground, my chest heaving as I stood there, watching the moment unravel like some cruel twist of fate. Lauren finally noticed me. Her smile faltered for a split second before she stepped back from Andy, her hand dropping from his shoulder. She looked startled, caught in the act, but there was no real panic in her eyes, just a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. "Hey," she said, her voice overly bright, as if she could talk her way out of this. "I didn't realize you were out here." I stared at her, my chest tight, my throat dry. I couldn't form words. Andy cleared his throat awkwardly, stepping back further. "I should, get back inside," he muttered, glancing at Lauren before disappearing into the house. We were alone now, the silence between us stretching like a chasm. Lauren opened her mouth as if to say something, but I cut her off. "Don't," I said, my voice shaking. "Don't even try." She closed her mouth, her expression shifting to something closer to guilt, or maybe frustration. It was hard to tell. "Let me explain," she started. But I shook my head. I turned and walked back toward the house, my chest burning with a mix of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. I needed space, air, anything to escape the suffocating weight of what I'd just seen. I didn't confront her at the party. Couldn't. Not then. It felt like the walls were closing in, the weight of the moment pressing down on my chest until I thought I'd suffocate. Without a word, I turned and walked out, my legs moving on autopilot as I pushed through the house and out the front door. The cool night air hit me like a slap, but it did nothing to clear the chaos in my head. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind was spinning, replaying the scene in the yard over and over again like a broken record. Lauren standing too close to him. Lauren kissing him. The smile on her face, the way her body seemed so at ease with his. When I got home, I didn't bother turning on the lights. I dropped onto the couch in the dark, staring at the blank television screen. The anger was there, bubbling just beneath the surface, but it was dulled by something heavier. Betrayal. Confusion. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. Saw them. The next morning, the knock at the door startled me. I hadn't been expecting her. Not so soon, anyway. For a moment, I considered not answering. But the knocking grew louder, more insistent, and when I finally opened the door, there she was. Lauren stood there, her eyes red and swollen, tears streaming down her face. She looked like a mess, the usual polish and confidence stripped away. "John," she said, her voice cracking as she stepped closer. "Let me explain. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, staring at her, waiting for her to continue. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Can we talk? Just for a minute." Something in me gave way, and I stepped aside, letting her in. She walked past me into the living room, and I followed, keeping my distance as she sat on the edge of the couch. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Finally, I broke it. "Explain," I said, my voice cold and flat. She flinched, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I didn't mean for you to see that," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." "Wasn't supposed to happen like that?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "So what?" "It was supposed to happen behind my back, where I wouldn't notice." She shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. "No, John, that's not what I meant. Please, just let me explain." I crossed my arms, leaning against the wall. "Go ahead," I said, my voice hard. She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she wiped at her eyes. "Andy, he's someone from my past," she said finally. "Someone I knew before I met you." I stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. "We were involved," she said, her voice breaking. "It was a long time ago, but things ended badly. I thought it was over, that I'd moved on. And I did, with you. I was happy, John. I swear I was. Happy," I snapped, my voice dripping with bitterness. "You call this happy? Sneaking around with him again? Kissing him at a party while I'm inside?" She winced, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed into her hands. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. "I swear. It just happened." "That's not good enough, Lauren," I said, my voice like ice. "You don't just accidentally start seeing someone from your past. When did this start?" She hesitated, her eyes darting away from mine. 2 months ago," she admitted quietly. "We ran into each other at a conference. I wasn't expecting to see him, and it stirred up a lot of old feelings. We started talking, and then you started seeing him again." I finished for her, my stomach twisting. She nodded, her head bowed in shame. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was confused, and I didn't know how to stop it. But I swear, John, I didn't want to hurt you." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "You didn't want to hurt me? Do you have any idea what you've done, Lauren? Do you even care?" "Of course I care," she cried, her voice desperate. "I love you, John. I do. I made a mistake, but it doesn't change how I feel about you." I stared at her, my chest heaving as I tried to process her words. She looked so small, so broken, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of something, sympathy, maybe, but it was quickly swallowed by the anger and betrayal burning in my chest. "You love me," I said, my voice cold. "You have a funny way of showing it." She sobbed harder, her hands covering her face as she crumpled into herself. I wanted to feel something for her in that moment. Pity, forgiveness, anything. But all I felt was the cold, hard weight of her betrayal. "I don't know if I can do this," I said finally, my voice shaking. "I don't know if I can forgive you." "Please, John," she begged, her voice cracking. "I'll do anything. Just tell me what to do, and I'll fix this. I'll make it right." But as I looked at her, I realized I didn't have an answer for her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. For now, all I wanted was for her to leave. The silence in the room stretched so long it felt unbearable. Lauren sat on the couch, her face streaked with tears, her shoulders trembling as she sobbed quietly. I stayed standing, arms crossed, as far away from her as I could be without leaving the room entirely. I needed the space, not just physically but emotionally. "I can't do this right now," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt heavy, almost choking me as they left my mouth. Lauren's head shot up, her eyes wide and filled with desperation. "John, no," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please don't say that. We can work through this. I know I messed up, but I'll do anything to fix it. Just tell me what to do." I shook my head, unable to meet her gaze for more than a second. "You've already done enough," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. "You didn't just mess up, Lauren. You betrayed me. You lied to me. And now you expect me to just what? Forget about it? Pretend it didn't happen? It wasn't like that," she said, her voice trembling. "It wasn't serious, John. I swear it wasn't. It was stupid, and it didn't mean anything. You mean everything to me. I know I've hurt you, but I love you." I couldn't stop the bitter laugh that escaped my lips. "Love? Is that what you call this?" I gestured wildly, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Do you have any idea what it felt like, watching you with him? Seeing you kiss him like I didn't even exist? Was that love, Lauren?" She flinched, tears streaming down her face as she shook her head. "No," she whispered. "It wasn't love. It was a mistake. A stupid, horrible mistake. But I'll make it right, John. I'll do whatever it takes. Please don't give up on us." Her words hit me, but they didn't soften the jagged edges of my emotions. They only made me feel colder, more detached. I wanted to believe her, to cling to the hope that this was just a terrible lapse in judgment. But how could I believe her? How could I trust anything she said when she'd been lying to me for months? "I need you to leave," I said, my voice steady but filled with a finality that even surprised me. Lauren froze, her tear-streaked face contorted with shock. "What? No, John, please don't do this. We can talk about this. We can figure it out together." I shook my head again, my resolve hardening.
No, Lauren.
I can't even think straight with you here. I need time. I need space to figure out whatever this is. But I can't do that with you in the house." She stood up, stepping toward me, her hands outstretched as if to touch me. I backed away instinctively, and she stopped in her tracks, her expression crumbling. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, her voice trembling. "This is my home too, John. You can't just kick me out." "It was our home," I said quietly. "But you're the one who destroyed that. Not me." Her lip quivered as she started to cry again, her sobs racking her body. "Please, John," she begged. "Don't do this. I'll stay in the guest room. I'll give you as much space as you need. Just don't make me leave. Please." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sight of her tears, the sound of her voice. It hurt. It hurt more than I thought it would. But it wasn't enough to change my mind. "You need to pack some things and go," I said, my voice flat, detached. "Stay with a friend, your parents, I don't care. But you can't stay here." She stared at me, her eyes wide and filled with disbelief. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "You can't mean that." I opened my eyes and met her gaze, my own resolve staring back at her. "I do," I said firmly. "I can't do this right now, Lauren. I can't even look at you without thinking about him, about what you did. So please, just go." Her face crumpled, and she turned away from me, her hands shaking as she wiped at her eyes. For a moment I thought she might keep arguing, that she'd try to convince me to change my mind. But then, with a defeated nod, she started toward the stairs. "I'll pack a bag," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. I watched her go, my heart pounding in my chest. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was a hollow ache spreading through me. This wasn't how I thought my life would turn out. This wasn't how I thought we would turn out. When she came back down, her bag slung over her shoulder, she hesitated at the door. "I'll call you," she said softly. "I'll give you time, John. But please, don't give up on us. I love you." I didn't respond. Couldn't. I just watched as she walked out the door, the sound of it closing behind her echoing through the empty house. And then, for the first time since it all began, I was alone. Completely, utterly alone. A few days passed after Lauren left, but the silence in the house wasn't the relief I thought it would be. It was suffocating. Every corner, every room, every photo frame on the wall seemed to scream her name. I wanted answers, clarity, anything to help me piece together what had happened to the life we had built. I wasn't ready to talk to Lauren, but the questions in my mind were unbearable. When my phone buzzed with a text from Haley, asking if I wanted to grab coffee and catch up, I jumped at the chance. Haley had always been a good friend to both of us, someone I trusted implicitly. If anyone could help me make sense of what was happening, it was her. We met at a small cafe, the kind of place Lauren and I used to frequent together. The familiarity of it stung, but I pushed the thought aside as I slid into the booth across from Haley. She smiled at me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. I hesitated, unsure how much I wanted to unload. "I've been better," I admitted finally. "I'm trying to make sense of everything. To be honest, Haley, I don't even know where to start." She nodded, her expression serious. "I figured as much," she said. "That's why I wanted to meet. There's something I think you should know about Andy." The sound of his name sent a wave of bitterness through me. "What about him?" I asked, my voice tight. Haley sighed, looking down at her coffee as if she were gathering her thoughts. "I knew Andy," she said quietly. "Years ago, before you and Lauren even met." Her words caught me off guard, and I leaned forward slightly. "You knew him?" She nodded. "We were in a relationship for about 2 years," she admitted. "It was serious, or at least I thought it was. But Andy, he wasn't the man I thought he was." "What do you mean?" Haley took a deep breath, her eyes clouded with memories. "He cheated on me," she said simply. "Multiple times, as it turned out. I didn't find out until after we'd broken up, but the signs were there all along. He had this way of making you feel special, like you were the only person in the world. But it was all an act. He was selfish, manipulative, and incapable of real commitment." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Lauren knew him back then?" Haley hesitated before nodding. "Yes," she said. "They crossed paths a few times while I was with him. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, maybe I should have." I sat back in my chair, trying to process what she was telling me. The man Lauren had been sneaking around with wasn't just some random person from her past. He was a serial cheater, someone who had already left a trail of broken hearts behind him. "I thought I knew her," I said quietly, more to myself than to Haley. "I thought I knew everything about her." Haley reached across the table, her hand resting on mine. "You're not to blame for this, John," she said gently. "Lauren made her choices. And Andy, he knows exactly how to manipulate people. He's probably saying all the right things, making her feel like she's missing something, like he can give her what she's looking for." I nodded, but her words did little to ease the knot in my chest. If anything, they made it worse. Later that evening, I found myself wandering aimlessly through the house. I ended up in our bedroom, where Lauren's side of the bed was still unmade, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. I wasn't sure why, but I opened the drawer of her nightstand. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of old paperbacks, was her diary. Lauren had always been a writer, jotting down her thoughts and feelings in neat, looping handwriting. I hesitated, feeling a pang of guilt at the thought of reading it. But the need for answers outweighed the guilt. Flipping through the pages, I saw the life of a woman I thought I knew. Entries about work, friends, and the mundane details of everyday life. But as I neared the more recent pages, her tone shifted. And then I saw his name, Andy. The first entry that mentioned him was dated about 2 months ago. She'd written about running into him at a conference, describing the encounter in vivid detail. Her words were effusive, almost giddy. Seeing Andy again was electric. It's like no time has passed. He hasn't changed a bit. Still as charming, still as confident. Being around him made me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in so long. I felt sick reading it, my stomach churning as I flipped to the next entry. We met for coffee today. I told myself it was just to catch up, nothing more. But sitting across from him, hearing him talk, laughing at his jokes, it was like stepping back in time. I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. I haven't felt this alive in years. The word alive seemed to jump off the page, taunting me. Was this what I had been reduced to? A life so dull and predictable that she needed him to feel alive again? I kept reading, each entry cutting deeper than the last. She described their secret meetings, the rush of excitement, the thrill of rediscovering a part of herself she thought she'd lost. But the worst part, the part that shattered me completely, was how little guilt she seemed to feel. There were mentions of me, fleeting and dismissive, as though I were an afterthought. John doesn't understand. He doesn't make me feel the way Andy does. It's not that I don't love him. I do. But I can't ignore this part of me anymore. I slammed the diary shut, my hands trembling. The woman who wrote those words wasn't the woman I thought I married. She wasn't the woman who had promised to stand by me, to love me, to be my partner in life. She was a stranger, and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to forgive her. The days that followed were a blur of anger, doubt, and an overwhelming sense of loss. I couldn't escape the questions swirling in my mind, no matter how hard I tried. Was it my fault? Had I done something or failed to do something that pushed Lauren away? I replayed every moment of our relationship, trying to pinpoint where things had gone wrong. Had it been my long hours at work? The late nights spent at the office, chasing deadlines instead of spending time with her? I'd always justified it to myself as something I was doing for us, for our future, for the life we were building together. But now, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd miscalculated, if I'd taken her for granted without even realizing it. Maybe I should have noticed the signs sooner. The way she'd started dressing up more, even on ordinary days. The subtle distance in her smiles. The way they didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. The way she'd laugh at her phone, then quickly put it down when I walked into the room. I wanted to believe that there was something I could have done differently, some way I could have stopped this from happening. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Because at the end of the day, it was her choice. Lauren didn't have to meet him for coffee. She didn't have to let him back into her life, let alone into her heart. She didn't have to lie to me, to sneak around behind my back, to kiss him in the yard at that damn party. None of that was my fault. She chose to go back to her past. She chose him. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how unfair it was for me to carry the blame for her choices. Yes, maybe I'd made mistakes. Maybe I hadn't been as attentive as I should have been, or as romantic, or as present. But that didn't excuse what she did. It didn't justify the lies, the betrayal, the complete disregard for the life we'd built together. What hurt the most was how easily she seemed to throw it all away. I couldn't stop thinking about the diary entries, her words replaying in my mind like a cruel mantra. Andy makes me feel alive. As if our life together had been nothing more than a dull routine, as if I'd been some shadow she'd been living in. Every memory we'd shared felt tainted now, like they had been rewritten in light of her betrayal. The vacations, the late-night conversations, the quiet mornings spent reading the paper together. They all felt hollow, like they belonged to someone else's story. I couldn't look at the photos on the walls without feeling sick. Her smile, once the brightest thing in my world, now seemed insincere, a mask she'd been wearing while secretly longing for something, or someone else. I didn't recognize her anymore. The Lauren I thought I knew was kind, compassionate, and fiercely loyal. She was the woman who laughed at my dumb jokes, who held my hand when life got tough, who stood by me through every challenge we faced together. But the Lauren who kissed Andy in the yard, who wrote those words in her diary, who looked me in the eye and begged for forgiveness after months of lying to me, that woman was a stranger. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I'd ever really known her at all. I hated the way my mind twisted itself in knots, oscillating between blaming myself and blaming her. I'd sit on the couch, staring at the darkened TV screen, replaying the past like some kind of masochist. Every fight we'd had, every misunderstanding, Every moment I'd chosen work or friends over her. It all came rushing back, feeding the self-doubt that gnawed at me. But then I'd think about her choices, about Andy, and the anger would flare up again, burning through the doubt like a wildfire. She didn't stumble into an affair. It wasn't an accident. She made a series of deliberate decisions, each one pulling her further away from me and closer to him. And now, I was the one left to pick up the pieces, to grapple with the reality of what she'd done. Our marriage had always felt solid to me, like a foundation I could rely on no matter what life threw at us. But now, it felt like that foundation had been built on sand, and the tide had come in, washing everything away. I wasn't just mourning the loss of Lauren. I was mourning the loss of who I thought she was, of the life I thought we had, of the future I thought we were building together. I didn't know how to move forward, or if I even could. All I knew was that the person I loved, the person I had trusted with my heart, my life, was gone. And in her place was a stranger who had left me questioning everything. It wasn't fair. But then again, none of this was. I clenched my fists, the anger rising in my chest again. If Lauren thought she could waltz back into my life and make this right with a few apologies and promises, she was wrong. Some things couldn't be fixed. Some things couldn't be forgiven. She had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. The decision to remodel the house wasn't something I planned. It was more like a survival instinct. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of Lauren. The beige walls she insisted on because they were timeless. The decorative throw pillows she'd painstakingly picked out, one by one, even though they were mostly for show. The framed pictures of us from trips we'd taken together, now sitting in a box in the garage. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a monument to the life we'd shared, and now that life felt like a lie. I couldn't live in a museum of us any longer. So, one evening, after sitting in the living room for far too long, staring at a wall that had started to feel like it was closing in on me, I grabbed my car keys and drove to the hardware store. I didn't have a plan, just an overwhelming need to change something. Anything. When I walked out of the store with a few cans of dark green paint, I wasn't thinking about symbolism or fresh starts. I just wanted something different, something that wouldn't remind me of her. The beige walls Lauren had adored were neutral, safe, and utterly lifeless. The green the first picked was bold, moody, and unapologetic. Felt like the opposite of her. The next morning, I pushed the furniture into the center of the living room and started painting. The strokes were uneven at first, but the more I painted, the steadier my hand became. It was therapeutic in a way, watching the beige disappear under a coat of deep green. Felt like I was reclaiming the space one wall at a time. I went room by room, pulling down curtains, swapping out light fixtures, and boxing up anything that reminded me of Lauren. The wedding photos came down first, followed by the decorative vases she loved to collect. The dining table centerpiece she'd picked out went straight into the donation pile. At some point, my brother Alex stopped by to check on me. He let himself in, as he always did, and whistled when he saw the mess I'd made. "Wow," he said, stepping over a tarp. "Didn't peg you for an interior designer." I glanced over my shoulder, paintbrush in hand. "It's not about design," I said. "It's about not seeing her everywhere I look." Alex nodded, leaning against the doorframe. "Makes sense. You don't want the ghosts hanging around." "Exactly," I said, dipping the brush into the paint. He watched me for a moment before speaking again, his tone softer. "You know, you don't have to blame yourself for what happened." I paused mid-stroke, turning to look at him. "What are you talking about?" "This," he said, gesturing around the room. "Everything you're doing. It's like you're trying to erase her and punish yourself at the same time. But you're not the one who screwed up, John. She did. Her choices are her responsibility, not yours." I set the brush down, rubbing the back of my neck. "I just can't stop thinking about what I could have done differently," I admitted. "Maybe if I'd worked fewer hours, or been more attentive, or—" Alex cut me off with a sharp shake of his head. "No," he said firmly. "Don't do that to yourself. You could have been the perfect husband, and it wouldn't have made a difference if she decided to cheat. That's on her, not you." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I picked up the brush and started painting again, the steady rhythm helping to drown out the noise in my head. Do you ever feel like you don't even know someone? I asked after a while. Alex sat down on the edge of the couch, careful to avoid the paint cans. Sure, he said, but that's on them, not you. You can only know what someone chooses to show you. His words stuck with me long after he left. Lauren had made her choices, and no amount of self-blame or second-guessing was going to change that. The renovations became my way of moving forward, one step at a time. I didn't just change the paint. I rearranged the furniture, replaced the linens, and even swapped out the dishes in the kitchen. It wasn't about running away from the past. It was about creating a future that didn't feel tied to her. By the time I finished, the house felt like mine again. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The weeks passed slowly, but as they did, the sharp edges of the pain began to dull. The house felt different now, not just because of the changes I'd made, but because it finally felt like my space, not a shrine to the life Lauren and I had built together. It was quiet, yes, but it was peaceful in a way I hadn't expected. The first few mornings without her had been the hardest. I'd wake up expecting to hear her moving around, the faint hum of her voice as she listened to a podcast or made coffee. Instead, there was silence, and for a while that silence had been unbearable. But slowly, I started to feel it. I took up running again, something I hadn't done in years. Started as a way to clear my head, but it quickly became more than that. A routine, a form of meditation. Each step, each mile, felt like I was leaving a piece of the past behind me, letting it fall away on the pavement. I reached out to old friends I hadn't spoken to in a while, grabbing drinks or meeting up for dinner. At first, the conversations felt awkward, like I was forcing myself to engage with the world. But over time, I started to enjoy it again, the laughter, the easy camaraderie, the reminder that there was still so much life to live. One evening, as I sat on the couch with a beer in hand, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, I found myself staring at Lauren's contact. Her name felt like a weight on the screen, heavy with all the things left unsaid. Without really thinking about it, I opened a new message and started typing. I hope you find what you're looking for. I wrote, my thumbs hesitating over the keys. I'll be okay. For a long moment, I just stared at the message, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to hit send, to let her know I was letting go, that I didn't hate her anymore. But another part of me knew it didn't matter. She'd made her choice, and now I was making mine. I closed the message without sending it, setting the phone down on the coffee table. It wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't about what she needed or what she was looking for. It was about me, about finding myself again, about rebuilding my life on my own terms. For so long, I'd defined myself by our relationship, by the life we shared. But now I saw that life for what it was. A chapter, not the whole story. And this chapter was over. I wouldn't pretend it didn't hurt or that I didn't still carry the weight of what happened. But the anger, the blame, the endless loop of what-ifs in my mind, they didn't hold the same power over me anymore. Instead, I started to think about what came next. I found joy in the small things. The way the morning light filtered through the new green walls of the living room. The satisfaction of cooking a meal for myself. The quiet pride of crossing off tasks from my to-do list. They were tiny victories, but they added up. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. I wasn't looking back anymore, wasn't drowning in memories or regrets. I was moving forward one step at a time. And while I didn't know exactly what the future held, I knew one thing for certain. I didn't need Lauren to find it. Our life together was over, but it had given me something valuable. A chance to start fresh, to build something new. And as I sat there in the quiet of my own space, I realized that was enough.